The Royal Air Force's flagship airshow returned in 2023, featuring 3 national aerobatic teams for the first time since the 1990s, as well as the final ever airshow appearance by an RAF Hercules.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Airshow Dispatches, coming to you from Cosford for the second consecutive year, the official airshow of the Royal Air Force, which this year is starring the Patrouille Suisse in what could be their final ever British airshow appearance. Let's get straight into the action. Here's a quick look at the lineup and running order.
So we're going to look at the flying display in chronological order, starting with the French and British parachute teams. We've got the Typhoon 12 minutes in, the Patrouille Suisse at the halfway point, the Reds at 44 minutes, and the F-35 right up towards the end of the programme. And I also want to show you this. We don't normally make a big deal of aircraft cancellations, but I've never seen quite as many as this before. 9 displays that cancelled due to operational or technical reasons outside the organiser's control, many of them cancelling at very short notice indeed. We even had aircraft that were bought in to replace those which cancelled due to technical problems, cancelling due to technical problems. The reason I mention this is because they lost about 90 minutes of air display participants. They were dealt an incredibly bad hand, and yet the Air Ops team just about managed to hold together a full-length and fairly fluid flying display. I don't know how they did that, but it's genuinely one of the most impressive organisational feats that I've seen at the 100-plus air shows that I've visited over the last 6 or 7 years. Let's get into the flying now, though. And arriving overhead, a Hercules C04 from the Royal Air Force, about to deposit the RAF Falcons parachute team. Forming into a snake formation, which replaces the Falcons stack, and then splitting into 2 separate snakes. It was interesting to speak to the team recently about some of the changes that they've made to their display over the last couple of years, and there's been a conscious decision to move away from technically demanding extreme close formation flying like the Falcon stack, in favour of these larger manoeuvres that fill more of the sky. Those 2 snake formations have now merged together for the carousel. This was a milestone display for the Falcons and the wider RAF because this was the final ever parachute jump from a Royal Air Force Hercules. The Hercules is being retired at the end of this month. In fact, it's only very recently that its replacement, the Atlas, has been fully cleared to take on all of the Hercules' parachuting duties. Specifically, today the team are jumping from a Hercules C4. That's the British name for the stretched C-130J-30. The standard C-130J is known as the Hercules C5. Those particular variants came into British service in 1999, although the RAF has operated older models of the C-130 as far back as 1966, so this month is the end of a very long and distinguished service career. The French Air Force has been a frequent supporter of the airshow at Cosford. We've seen their Rafale at the show last year, for example, and we covered that occasion on Airshow Dispatches. This year, however, they chose to send something entirely new not just to Cosford, but to the UK as a whole, because this was the first time that Team Fenix has participated in a British airshow. It's interesting, having talked a moment ago about the Falcons' display routine, to see them jump back-to-back with a parachute team that is at completely the other end of the spectrum. Extreme close formation flying, to the point that the jumpers are actually in physical contact with each other. We'll be seeing this group again next week, not only jumping at Cosford, but they're also at the Antidotum Airshow Leszno in Poland, where they'll be using an OV-10B Bronco as their jump ship. That's a new party trick that they've been showing off quite a bit this season. And now the fly-through by the Hercules. This is the final appearance at an airshow of a Hercules in RAF hands. But returning to the subject of parachuting, anyone who attended the Cosford Airshow last year, or who watched our Airshow Dispatches film of the show for that matter, might recall that last year's jump ship for the Falcons was a Royal Air Force Chinook HC-6A from the Chinook display team. As you would expect, the Chinook display team was present at Cosford once again, as in fact were the vast majority of the RAF's display teams, the only exception being their Tutor T1 solar display, which was sadly affected by a fleet-wide grounding of the Tutor aircraft that came into force in the days before the show. Pitching up now for a nose-over. A healthy dose of blade slap there, a phenomenon caused when the rotors on one rotor head pass through the vortices created by the other rotor head. All helicopters can create blade slap in the right conditions up to an extent, but with its two overlapping rotor heads, it is particularly commonplace for the Chinook. The RAF is the largest foreign operator of the Chinook, and the bulk of the fleet is made up of HC-6A aircraft like this one. They are actually CH-47D Chinook HC-1s dating back to the 1980s, but upgraded to CH-46F or CH-6 standard. The RAF also operates a number of new-build Chinook HC-6s, 14 of those to be precise. Now the aircraft approaches for the quick stop. As the flying display programme continued, the best laid plans began to unravel. We had been due to see a three-ship display from the Battle of Britain Memorial flight featuring a Spitfire, Hurricane and Lancaster. The Lancaster unfortunately was not able to take off at its allotted slot time due to a technical problem, depriving us not only of that wonderful three-ship formation, but also of the two-ship Typhoon and Lancaster sequence that was supposed to follow it. Luckily, the BBMF's engineers at Coningsby don't give up easily, and for the second time in as many weeks, they poured enormous effort into getting the Lancaster up and running. So although it couldn't perform as scheduled, it was at least able to make it to Cosford later in the day for a solo display. It's interesting to note, last weekend when exactly the same thing happened at the Midlands Air Festival, we saw the BBMF's fighters swap from their 3-ship display sequence to a 2-ship tail chase. This week, they've done something rather different. They've basically flown a loser plan, flying the normal BBMF 3-ship display sequence just with one aircraft missing. Speaking of which, the BBMF Spitfire Solo still comprises a very similar display sequence to the one they developed last year to mark the Platinum Jubilee, with a focus on tall and graceful quarter clovers. The second fighter typically then flies a lower energy performance, predominantly non-aerobatic, but keeping things a little bit closer to the crowd as a result. Following that, on to the first of the day's fast jets, Flight Lieutenant Matt Brighty in the RAF Typhoon FGR4. Those of you who joined us for our previous episode from the Midlands Air Festival will recall that I wasn't entirely won over by this year's display, but I'm certainly backtracking now because what we saw at Cosford was absolutely outstanding. Eurofighter solos don't get much better than this, and the next manoeuvre is perhaps my favourite of all, a -G bunt into a steep dive directly towards the spectators on the right 45-degree line. How imposing is that? Actually slightly different to the published display routine, which includes an aileron roll during the dive, but Brighty was keeping the aircraft so tight to the spectators that there didn't seem to be enough room for that. Now, setting up for another on-crowd dive, this time with rolls, 1.5 of them to be precise. Nice use of the intermediate display lines to reduce the time taken to reposition between each pass. Out on the left 45, then a hard left turn to return on the A-axis just a few seconds later, and this time it's for a very slow roll, something we haven't seen from other Typhoon display pilots in recent years. We'll be seeing a few of these slow rolls in the programme today, and I'll be paying them some special attention, so we'll revisit this topic later. But an average roll rate there of 27 degrees per second, slow enough that we even saw a brief vent of fuel from the transfer line at the top of the tail in the inverted portion of the roll. That's normally something we only see during a prolonged -G push. The transfer line, by the way, is there to allow air to escape from the fuel tanks during air-to-air refuelling. In now at the slow for a high alpha pass. And now accelerating from that very slow pass into a loop. So the aircraft setting up now for a 360-degree maximum rate turn, but even in a high G turn, the Typhoon possesses so much power that it can continue to accelerate. In order to avoid this happening and control the radius of that turn so as not to overfly the crowd, the reheat will be disengaged just as it goes out of sight. Watch those thrust buckets carefully. Then as the aircraft comes back towards us, once the pilot is confident he's not going to bust the display line, those afterburners can be reignited just before they come back into view. There's a telltale puff of smoke when that happens, which you can see now. And that's a part of the choreography which RAF Typhoon displays have historically taken into account very well, not just using the reheat to provide thrust, but also timing its use very carefully so we in the crowd are exposed to that power at the most impactful moments. You'll notice a standard grey aircraft being used today. The RAF does have a special scheme jet known as Blackjack. It was originally intended to be used for the 2021 and 22 display seasons, but its use has been extended for at least another year. Sadly, the aircraft experienced a minor engine fire on the ground 1 week previously, and so a spare is being used. Well, that is a very tough act to follow, but I have to say I thought Project Lynx were more than up to the task. If you cast your mind back to 2022, last year's Cosford Airshow featured the UK flying display debut of an ex-British Army Lynx. Well, I'm delighted to say that there are now 2 of them displaying in civilian hands, and this is the second. The Lynx we saw last year came from historic helicopters and made its post-restoration flight in 2021. This example is operated by Project Lynx based at North Weald and made its first flight last year. Its flying display debut came in May 2023 at the Shuttleworth season premiere Airshow. Of course, in military hands, the Lynx was known for its rolls and backflips at airshows, not least as part of the defunct Blue Eagles aerobatic team. Well, it's not allowed to do that anymore, but this is a pretty sprightly display nonetheless, surprisingly so, I thought. Some very steep pitch angles that look to be almost 90 degrees nose down at points. This, along with historic helicopters example, is a Lynx AH-7, an ex-Army aircraft. But Project Lynx is also working to restore an ex-Royal Navy Lynx HMA-8. That's a type that was retired in 2018.
Following on from the exploits I mentioned in the first Gulf War, later Army Lynx were participants in the multinational intervention in the Balkans during 1990. Iraq in 2003, and 2006 they were active in Afghanistan, and for a very long time they were stalwarts of British operations in Northern Ireland, of course, alongside other Army Air Corps assets such as the de Havilland and Beaver. Final pass, I think, here, and probably landing on the far side of the airfield to go and refuel over there. 2 former Army Lynx pilots at the controls of this display.
The quiet interlude now, courtesy of Ian Gallagher, flying an ASK-21 of the Royal Air Force Gliding and Soaring Association. There's a lot of energy management involved, as you can probably imagine, especially when it comes to the latter stages of the flight, because there's only one shot at the approach and landing. But needless to say, Gally, who is one of the UK's foremost glider display pilots, did an excellent job. He ended his display in trademark style with a sequence of low-level upwind loops along the runway, followed by an even lower downwind pass in the opposite direction. And that leads into a gentle wing over to reverse direction for landing. Here comes the first of our 3 national teams, the first time in many years that Cosford Airshow has hosted so many. And it's the Royal Jordanian Falcons.
And then after that, the team will be transitioning into a left-hand barrel roll. Again, tracing the outline of the inside of an imaginary barrel.
This is the first show of their annual Goodwill tour around Europe. The aircraft recently arrived at Shawbury, flown in by Jordanian C-130 for reassembly. We'll be seeing them again in a few days' time at their next tour stop in Leszno. That's the first of a couple of shows in Poland. Then back to the British Isles for Riyadh and a couple of Irish shows before finishing their season in France and Belgium.
A turn to the right.
It's a very impressive display sequence nowadays, which has much improved over the last 6 or 7 years or so, not least thanks to the adoption of these very nicely painted Extra 330 LXs in 2018, replacing their previous fleet of Extra 300Ls. Interludes by the soloist help to cover the gaps when the main formation is either reforming or repositioning, and then the 2 sections of the team usually come together to cross, passing the metaphorical baton from one section to the other.
Shell aviation now disbanded, of course, but 2XL still active in so many other areas. You might have seen in the static display, we had them at Cosford many times. Also, the Extra 300, the mount of the Chilean Air Force aerobatic team, the Alconer, and the 330 model equips the French national competition.
Here is one of those crosses, as the soloist intersects the trio. They are arriving inverted on the B-axis. Next, a very challenging half-slow roll, leading into an opposition split. And this little sequence makes up their most famous manoeuvre, the Hashemite break.
As they now roll the right way up and heading towards the display data for the Hashemite break.
The wingmen go up into stall turns at either end of the display line before diving back towards each other. Out of sight, the leader is doing likewise high above at show centre, commencing a 3-way opposition pass. This team originally came about because the late King Hussein of Jordan was a pilot, a huge aviation enthusiast and a regular visitor to air shows in the UK. In fact, the King Hussein Memorial Sword, the award given annually to the best overall display participant at the Royal International Air Tattoo, is named in his honour. It was at his decree that a national aerobatic team was established in 1976, initially comprising 2 pit specials with pilots hired in from the United States. The modern team is staffed by personnel from the Royal Jordanian Air Force.
The solo pilot used to fill the gaps between the main formation heading away and returning.
And now, a very tricky rejoin indeed. The soloist from the right and the main formation from the left crossing at show centre. And both pulling up. The trio in a tricky line abreast formation, but not for long, the wingmen falling back into Vic as they come down off this loop. Meanwhile, the soloist has executed a very tight half loop and is now bearing down on his teammates inverted. A hesitation roll to erect as he slots back into the foreship box formation just in time for the team to commence the run-in for the next manoeuvre. Absolutely phenomenal. And that next manoeuvre shall be a very challenging slow roll, much like the one we saw from the Typhoon, but with the added complexity of having 3 extra aircraft. This is hard enough to do as a soloist, but the wingmen have a very tricky job indeed. For them, this is apparently by far the hardest part of the display. 21 seconds to complete that roll. That is a roll rate of only 17 degrees per second. Absolutely extraordinary. Now, the team approach on the B-axis for their last manoeuvre, the Concorde break. I mentioned that the Royal Jordanian Falcons flew the Pit Special back when they were first created. Well, here is one piloted by British Airshow stalwart Rich Goodwin. Rich has just completed development of his new Jet Pits, an aircraft much like this one but fitted with 2 Lynx turbojet engines on the nose, giving it a power to weight ratio of greater than 1:1. The aircraft made its public air display debut at Bidford Wings and Wheels at the end of May, followed by the English Riviera Airshow at the start of June, and it was supposed to be displaying at Cosford.
Snap rolls to the right and a yawing turn to the left.
Sadly, that was not to be, due to insurance reasons as I understand it, but Rich was able to bring the jet pits in for static display and performed in his original so-called muscle biplane instead.
And when he's established on the 45-degree downline, he'll be performing some more snap rolls. And an amazing rate of roll this aeroplane. And now coming towards the end of this display.
This aircraft is in itself highly modified, a new engine, propeller and wing, among other improvements. Surprisingly limited in G though, -5 or +6. Not that you'd think that was the case from watching this display.
And there he is on the knife edge. Excellent chance to see very
Arriving now for his trademark knife edge pass to close the show. In the previous episode of Airshow Dispatches, we saw Kevin Hale's Oster AOP6 solo display. Well, the Cosford Airshow 1 week later saw him debut something new, a two-ship formation act with an 01 bird dog.
This is not that well known, but it's sort of been reassigned subsequently to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force that remained in Japan through the 1970s. It then
Kevin reminded me it's not actually the first time he's been involved in a formation display. He flew a two-ship sequence with Simon Tilling in the Chipmunk in 2020 and 2021, known as the Gypsy Pair. Simon Tilling is now the CEO of the Light Aircraft Association, by the way.
one of the first of the post-war military marks, which went through several other iterations. Back to the aircraft heading in from right to left. Left to right, meanwhile, is the Cessna L9T.
On that occasion, it was a sequence of relatively gentle formation passes, but this time around, Kevin is in the fortuitous position of having a wingman with considerably more power at his disposal than he has. And that has opened up opportunities for tail chases and brakes and rejoins that simply weren't practical with the Chipmunk.
Army bird dog had 12 feet of its starboard wing shot off by anti-aircraft fire, but was repaired and flew again the next day. I'm not sure
This bird dog is a fine specimen of the type. It emerged from restoration in 2021 and won the prestigious Freddie March Spirit of Aviation Award at the Goodwood Revival Concours d'Elegance the very same year.
so heavily used in the
You'll notice in these pictures it's fitted with dummy folding fin aerial rockets and magnesium parachute flares, which the bird dog crews would use to mark targets for dedicated bombers and attack aircraft.
It came at a price, though. 469 bird dogs in all were lost in Vietnam, where they were also flown by the US Marine Corps, by the South Vietnamese, and by various clandestine operators like the CIA's Air America. No doubt for a break. Oh, and a nice crossing break. It's quite interesting that the bird dog had such a long service life because
Following that, it was time for National Aerobatic Team number 2, the Patrouille Suisse. We start with some six-ship formation work, during which we'll see some fairly standard six-ship shapes, but also some highly unusual ones, many of them inspired by Swiss symbols, culture and topography. The next pass sees the team flying in Lightning formation, marking the Swiss Air Force's selection of the F-35 as its next combat aircraft.
Lightning, go. So we stop.
Patrouille Suisse are the only official military aerobatic team in Western Europe to fly frontline fighters. The aircraft in question are F-5E Tiger IIs, of which Switzerland operates just 18. The fleet is being gradually wound down. Their out-of-service date has been repeatedly set back over the years, but it's now looking like the aircraft will leave service sometime between 2025 and 2027. That means this is very probably one of the final display seasons for the Patrouille Suisse, and perhaps the last opportunity to see them in UK skies.
The voice you hear on the radio is live from the cockpit.
It will be a very sad day when this team is finally disbanded, They have been a much-loved asset on the European airshow circuit since 1964, when they were established to mark the 50th anniversary of the Swiss Air Force. They are a remarkable team in many ways, not least because in their 59-year history, they have never had a fatal accident, not one. Five aircraft approach from the left, the soloist is inbound from the right, and this is a classic Patrouille Suisse manoeuvre called the tunnel. And this one is called the Flirt, Tiger 5 barrel rolling around his counterparts. And then the leader increases the complexity with a turn to the right. And now Tiger 5, the second soloist, breaks away.
And our second solo, Bigfoot, Tiger sequence, split from the main formation.
For display duties, most of the Patrouille Suisse liveried F5s have been fitted with a smoke generator. The right-hand cannon has been removed to facilitate that, replaced with a diesel tank. Another classic Patrouille Suisse manoeuvre from Tigers 5 and 6, the mirror. A total of 12 F5s are maintained in Patrouille Suisse colours. This isn't a full-time team though, so all of those aircraft are used for regular military operations when they're not flying airshows. Actually, it's quite useful to have them in this colour scheme because the duties of this aircraft type include air combat training and target tugging, when this high visibility scheme is actually quite useful. The F5 has a very good performance in roll, partially enabled by its relatively small wingspan of just 8.1 metres. A peak roll rate there of about 225 degrees per second. That's a good 50% faster than anything we saw from the Typhoon earlier on. Now over to the main formation for the Finale Grande. Up next, Bob Davies' Yak 3 UTI. It's one of 5 Yak 3 UTIs built in Romania in the 1990s from the original plans, but fitted with a Pratt & Whitney R2000 engine rather than the original Shvetsov. Nowadays, sourcing the parts to keep a Russian radial engine running would be prohibitively difficult. The Yak 3 UTI was a radial engine 2-seat trainer version of the Yak 3U fighter. Standard Yak 3U had an inline Klimov engine. It became the prototype for the very widely used Yak 11 trainer, the main difference being that the Yak 11 had a longer, larger cockpit, but otherwise the two types are almost identical. It was interesting to see Bob's display has changed quite a lot since I last saw it a couple of years ago. Gone are the laps behind the back of the crowd, and we see instead a much tighter and more conventional style of warbird solo, as you can see.
Undertook harassment of Western aircraft using the air corridors, which were the only routes from West Germany across East German territory to the divided city of Berlin. It's something of a miracle there weren't more such disasters as that.
Following that, a pair of flypasts by the successor to the Hercules in RAF service, the Atlas C1. It is a vastly more capable aircraft than what came before, nearly double the payload of the Hercules and more than double the range. That being said, such a large aircraft isn't always necessary, and it's interesting to see France and Germany buying new-build C-130Js to serve alongside their A400Ms at exactly the same time that we are ridding ourselves of the Hercules. Great to see the Atlas fleet getting a bit of airtime, because it's an aircraft we see so rarely at air shows. The last time would have been in North America during the Red Arrows 2019 tour, and I think the next most recent example of the RAF performing at an air show with the Atlas was at Cosford 2018. Going to take the most cursory of glances now at the Rolls-Royce Heritage Flight, who provided consecutive solo displays by their Spitfire PR-19 and P-51D Mustang. We do end up covering this pair a lot, and that includes featuring them for several minutes in the previous episode of Airshow Dispatches from the Midlands Air Festival. So just a quick glimpse on this occasion, and if you want to see more, then do check out the previous episode.
Long-range bomber escort were not the raison d'etre of an aeroplane powered by an Allison V1710 engine. This in spite of the outstanding Mustang airframe.
Of course, it wouldn't be Cosford without the Red Arrows.
Red 1 pulling the Chinook up 4 to 5G at over 400 miles per hour as they collapse on the wall formation which they've got
Arriving in war formation and pulling up, collapsing into 8 Arrow as they do so, and yes, flying just 8 aircraft this year, that's a training limitation. All the newbies fly in Enid, that's Reds 1 to 5, but Red 1 is the team leader, and either Red 4 or Red 5 has to be a second year pilot to help keep an eye on the rookies, so that only leaves space for 3 trainees, hence the maximum number being 8 this year. Here's something we haven't seen in a while, rollbacks in the first half of the Red Arrow's display, and here they're used to change formation from 8 Arrow to Vixen. This year's Red Arrow's display nicely debunks an argument that's long been made about the Reds. It's often been said that they can't fly as an 8 ship because their formations don't work with an even number of aircraft.
Space transformed in 2021 and it reaching its initial operating capability in 2022.
I always thought that was an odd argument because there are some great 8-ship teams around, the Patrouille de France and Black Eagles to name but 2. What's certainly true is that it's always easier to lose 2 aircraft rather than 1 because you can maintain the symmetry of the shape without having to move anybody else around. But with a little bit more effort, namely moving Red 7 from the second slot position to an outer wingman position, 8-ship formations work perfectly well, as you can see. You might recall a few minutes ago we saw the Patrouille Suisse in Lightning formation to represent the F-35, and now we're about to see the Red Arrow's 8-ship version of depicting the same aircraft type. The team has had quite an unusual pre-season training timeline this year, disrupted, for want of a better word, by the coronation. That meant that Operation Springhawk had to be split into 2 separate deployments, the first of which was to Croatia and the second to Greece. The team are increasingly using Croatia as a training base, although last year it was just a short stop en route to Greece. But they're basing themselves at Zemunik and working alongside the Croatian national team Krila Oluye. It's always good to see those relationships growing, and perhaps that will tempt Krila Oluye back into British skies in the future, because they're a fantastic team that we haven't seen enough of. Heart standing out well against the nice blue sky there. The smoke colour for the Heart chosen based on the cloud conditions. If it's cloudy, they'll use red smoke, and then reduce the use of coloured smoke in one of the subsequent manoeuvres to compensate. There is only 1 minute of red smoke per aircraft after all, but if it's a nice blue sky like today, then white stands out much better, so that's what they'll use. Enid formation coming in now for the rollbacks. Red 5 just about managing to slot into position in time. Enid don't have long to get formed up for this particular manoeuvre. Their air brakes deployed throughout the rollbacks. That means more drag, a higher power setting, and in turn thicker and more vibrant smoke.
As this red smoke comes on, a red 2 and 3 roll around the rest of the formation. Clear and go is the call as red 4 and 5 roll around. And clear the call, the rollback.
And the same again in a moment. As the synchro pair perform their last opposition pass, outside the red arrows there aren't many times when you'll see jets flying aerobatics with their boards out. Manoeuvre, I'm afraid to say, is not one I'm hugely keen on because, as you can see, it looks a little odd if you're not bang on show centre. If you're in the right place, this looks like an infinity symbol, and hence this is called the infinity break. Time now for a great personal favourite of mine, and indeed of the Flying Control Committee it turned out, who awarded it the Hartree Memorial Trophy for the most accurately flown display routine of the day. It's Christophe Simon in the Cap 10C. Christophe takes inspiration from the French Air Force's Rafale solo display and tries to emulate the way in which they keep the action both continuous and compact. That is something he has most certainly achieved, with an excellent display sequence that is fast winning admirers on the airshow circuit. I love these very imaginative forms of hesitation rolls, 90 degrees to the left, 360 to the right, and then 270 left again. Then a full aileron roll to finish. Now another of these very slow rolls, 33 degrees per second here. It's almost as slow as a Typhoon. And Christophe doesn't have a fly-by-wire control system to help him. Then, full deflection for a maximum rate roll, which takes him 2.4 seconds. That's a roll rate of 150 degrees per second exactly. A half Cuban with a hesitation roll on the downline, and a very uncomfortable manoeuvre coming up next. It's a negative G push, and once erect at the top, a half roll to complete the loop conventionally. And now, one final wing rock to end the display.
I think you'll agree with me, he succeeded for the final time this afternoon from the left. Christophe Simon, Cap 10.
We are most of the way through the flying programme now, and it's time to talk about some of the challenges of the day. We didn't have a very good time when it came to military contributions from partner air arms. The Belgian NH-90 arrived but suffered a technical problem on practice day and was unable to validate its display. That sadly excluded it from the flying programme. We were due to see a US Air Force KC-135, which cancelled due to operational reasons with just a few hours to go. And the Royal Navy Black Cats had to withdraw from the show due to a staffing shortage. Again, at very short notice. The Royal Navy instead provided this Wasp HAS-1 from the Navy Wings Heritage Flight. I don't know which of the aircraft's serviceability gods Cosford has angered, but we also lost the Catalina, Jet Provost and B-17 from the flying lineup, as they aren't currently airworthy. They in turn were replaced by the Norwegian Air Force Historical Squadron's Vampire FB-52, but, you've guessed it, that went tech as well and was unable to start for takeoff. In one of the most commendable pieces of airshow flexibility I can remember seeing at a recent UK airshow. The night before gates opened, the organisers went out and found a static display participant that was suitably qualified to be moved to the flying display. They dragged Kennet Aviation's Stearman out of the vintage village for what would become its first flying display appearance away from its home base at Old Warburton. But despite all of these obstacles, whatever sorcery the Air Ops team were using, it worked. The show had to go on, and it did, for the full allotted 5.5 hours, with only one major pause. Anyone who went into that show, not knowing what specific aircraft to expect, would have encountered a perfectly typical flying display from a timing perspective. That, in the circumstances, is a massive compliment to the organisers and air operations team. The only real gap in the programme preceded this brief appearance by an F-35B Lightning. And it was great to see slightly more of the F-35 than we have in its previous appearances, 3 passes rather than the usual 2. That's all we can get from the F-35 at the moment. Any more than 3 passes, it becomes a display rather than a flypast. That needs a dedicated pilot with a public display authorization, and that is a long way off. The F-35 was planned to be the finale of the flying display, but the Lancaster's earlier technical hiccup was fixed over the course of the afternoon, and the display was extended to allow it to perform a solo at the end of the day.
To help support us at the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, we offer 2 fantastic membership options through our partners, the BBMF Official Club.
Cosford was the start of a ludicrously busy 10 days or so for us, because post-Cosford, I've had 2 days to edit and publish this before heading abroad to catch some fantastic air shows in Poland and Italy, both taking place on the same weekend. Join me next time for F-104s, Tornadoes, Lightnings, Mustangs and more, the 100th anniversary of the Italian Air Force, with an airshow for the ages at Pratica di Mare. Thank you for watching, and from me, Adam Landau, it's goodbye for now.